Hello YouTube, welcome to this Springboot learning moment, I guess. You probably have implemented authentication and authorization, but you don't have a way to restrict access to resources based on ownership. What do I mean by that is basically, let's say if I want to retrieve information about user 1, I cannot do that unless I'm user 1, so I have to be logged in and authenticated and authorized as user 1. So the way everybody shows authentication and authorization is basically the basics plus using this has authority role admin and this permit hole. This is not sufficient to do authorization based on ownership, and what we have to do is to use this access method, which takes an authorization manager, which is this user security class, which is a class that I injected right here, and we have to build ourselves. So how do we build our class? We can see here the class is we have to implement the authorization manager interface of type request authorization context, and to do so we have just to override one method, which is check. This method takes an authentication supplier and a request authorization context. So let's start maybe by describing the plan before see what we are doing here. So the way I do authentication in this case is basically I have this JWT token, and to this token I have added a user ID claim and an authorities claim, and we basically use these two. We can also use the username, which is a field that it's standard to every JWT token. The idea is basically to use this user ID to verify if the logged in user is the owner of the information that is asking for. So for example, if I'm asking about like what are the information of user 1, the first thing we have to check is that I am user 1. So we have to check that this user ID here is actually user 1. The way we do it is basically inside this authorization decision check. And we want to, I forgot to tell you that we want to grant access in two cases. Either the user that is asking for the resource is an admin, or I am a normal user, but I am the owner of the resource. So the first thing we do is we get the authentication from the authentication supplier using the get method. If the user is an admin, we want to grant the authorization. If it's not, we don't want basically to authorize them. So to check if it's an admin, we can do that from the authentication with this isAdmin method. We extract basically the authorities from the authentication, and then we check in these authorities is if any matches the admin role. The admin role is just a string that I defined here. And if they have the admin role, we grant access to the resources. The second thing that we want to check, if the user is not an admin, it might be the owner of the resource that is being asked. So the first thing we do, we check that the authentication is an instance of JWT authentication token, which it is if you are logged in, since you will be sending the token together with the request. And if it is, we go ahead. If it's not, we basically deny access. So the first thing we do, we take the authentication and we cast it into a JWT authentication token. And then we want to extract the user ID from this JWT authentication token, which is the value that is inside here, which is this one. and we save it in the JWT user ID variable. And then we need the user ID of which we want the information, right? Because like the request, if we go in the user controller, it's a get, and we put in the user ID of which we want the information about. So we extract this user ID from the context. There is this function which is get variables, which returns basically a dictionary of the variables, and we want the one that is under a user ID. This user ID comes from here in the security. Get is this user ID right here. So for example, if we go localhost blah 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 /user /1, the user ID in our user security class, the request user ID will be 1. And then we simply want to check if these two match. So this is the user ID extracted from the URL basically, and this is the user ID extracted from the JWT token. So it's the user that is currently logged in. And then we simply check if they match. If so, we grant authorization. If not, we deny it. Now, this is not the best approach. It works in this case because mine is a small application, and the admin status, it's not something that changes that fast in my application, so we can get it directly from the JWT token. The most correct way to do this would be to get the user ID from the request, and then fetch the user from the database and check for the data that we need to authenticate the user. Because for this purpose, basically check if the user is the owner or an admin, it works quite well. But imagine that maybe you have a platform where some users share a project, and one is the owner of the project, and another one has basically just the permit to read. If the admin of this resource bans a user, so it revokes his permit to read the resources. If you have a JWT token which is not expired yet, and that JWT token grants you the read permit, basically, you can still read the resource even if the owner revoked your permit to do so. If you fetch the user from the database instead of reading from the JWT token, you will be able to see that that user is no longer authorized to access that resource, which is a better way to do it. I can show you an example of it, maybe. This is the diagram of my application. So if, for example, we take the address, because maybe you don't even have the user ID on the URL, so you don't know who the user is. When you get an address, everything that you have to put in is the address ID. So you won't have the user ID. You cannot check who is the owner of the address by using just the URL and the JWT token. So what I do in address, it's quite simple. I use the address to get the user ID, because if you see, the address contains the user ID as foreign key. So in address security, what I do is still check if the logged in user is an admin, because if it's an admin, there is no point on doing further research if it's the owner or not. If it's not an admin, we get basically the address ID from the URL, as we did before with user. So from the context, we get the variables, and then we get the one which is called address ID, which I remember it comes from here. So addresses get, when we go addresses / address ID, this is the user ID we get in here. And once we have that, we use this to fetch the address from the database. We call the address service, find by ID, we get the address. And then since the address contains the user, because again, this is my relationship diagram, and the relationships are all bidirectional. So the user has the address and the address has the user. So if I retrieve the address, basically I have the owner ID, which I get here. Address get user get ID. This one fetches basically the ID of the user that owns this address. And then we can simply check if this ID and the one in the JWT authentication token is the same ID. But what if you don't use like IDs in the URLs, you don't pass them simply. Another thing that you can do is access directly the body of the request. Oops. And the way you do it is basically this little piece of code here. We can get the servlet request from the context. Then we can basically turn this this body into a string with this function here, which is this function down here. Takes the request. We have a string builder. We need this string builder because the only way we have to access the body of the request is using a buffer reader. This request.getReader will return a buffer reader. Then we basically just use a buffer to read the whole HTTP request body and build a string that contains it. This is what basically this piece of code does. I'll show you also the results. We print out basically the body request, so you will be able to see the results in a moment. Then what we want to do, we cast this object to JSON so that we can have an easier time accessing the field that we need. So for example, the request body, for example, for a put request of an address will contain basically the address information. Like I can show you the address DTO, which is used to modify an address. We will get the ID of the address, the user DTO, country, state, city, and so on. And from this we can get the address if we don't pass it like as a, for example, as a string in your URL, or also the ID of the user directly from the body of the request, so that we can compare with the JWT token of the currently logged in user. So let's get back to our address security. Here, for example, I don't need this, but I extracted the user DTO and then the user ID, and I printed it to screen. I can show you maybe the test for it. So we make a put request. This is the DTO that we will send. We do the request to this URL, addresses /1, so we want the information about address 1. Remember that we use this number to go fetch the address and get the user ID from that address. We then match it from the user ID which is currently logged in. The authorization, we take it from the header. This is the JWT token of user number 2. I have two users. User 1 is an admin, so has access to everything, and user 2 is just a normal user. So this test should fail. Just to remember you briefly, this works because in the security configuration in address we ask access this.address security, which is what we saw earlier, and this again grants access only if you are either the owner of this address or you're an admin. And by you I mean the currently logged in user. Let's run this test and see what happens. So this should fail, because I'm user 2 currently and asking to modify address 1, and I don't have permission to do it. So the test fails, but we can go and see all the data that has been extracted. This is just okay. So here are we inside our address security. Just to go ahead with the implementation, we are basically here, and we just checked that we are not admin. This check failed. This context.get variables shows all the variables of the context that are basically the variables on your URL. In this case, we only have address ID equal 1. We then get this variable with context.get variables.get address ID. We cast it to an integer. Now, if we want to extract something from the body of the request, we can do it, how I explained before, and these are the result. This is the request body that is right here. We can see that includes the ID of the address, the user DTO, which contains the ID of the user and some information about the user. Just keep in mind this is the request, so this is information that we pass to our server. So this can also be wrong or forged somehow. So what you should do here is use the services, go get address 1, get the user ID from address 1, and then check if that ID is the same of the JWT token. Here is basically the extraction of the various field, JSON body. This is basically this right here, which is the whole body of the object. And then this is the extracted user ID, which is here. Also, I'm going a little bit fast just to give the idea, then feel free to pause everything and look at the code and look at the results. Anyway, I don't need this data just to show you another possibility. I get the address from the database using user services and the address ID provided in the URL. And then I get the ID of the user associated to that address. And then I either grant or not the authorization based on if these two match. Is user, maybe would have been more correct, call it is owner. It just checks if these two are the same. Is user, takes an authentication. From the authentication, again checks if it is a JWT token authentication. If it is, it casts it to a JWT authentication token. We get the user ID from the JWT token, and then check if it's equal to the user ID that it's associated with the address that we requested. And that's it. You can see the test fails because we are logged in with user 2 and we are requesting information about user 1, but you can also see that if we change the token and we use the token for user 1, which is just token, and we rerun the test, this will basically succeed. By the way, I have a script that automatically puts data in the database when testing is done, like in your all this stuff. You can see that it passes because basically the user is not only the admin in this case, it's also the owner. That's it basically. This is how you do it. I don't know if there is a better way, but this is how I did it. Again, remember, don't get like the information straight just from the URL, just look in the database, fetch the original data that it's in database, and compare user ID between the authenticated one and the one it is in the database. If you have to check for a specific role, like owner of resources, or as reader access or writer access or something like that, fetch the user from the database, look at his permits, and see if it has it from there. Don't take it from the JWT authentication token, because you don't know if that permit has been revoked or what, because JWT token are valid for a specific period of time, but the database will be always up to date. That's it.